At a certain age, noise fades, but the need for meaning grows louder. If you've ever felt that leadership today has lost its depth, or that respect is no longer earned through quiet strength, this story is for you. In a forgotten Texas town, Chuck Norris doesn't just confront danger, he revives honor, presence, and legacy. By the end, you'll see how true influence is not in control, but in calm. If this resonates with you, drop a comment with your own story, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful tales that speak to who we're still becoming. The late October sky in central Texas hung low, draped in that soft silver light that only seems to visit when the year is turning quiet. The kind of sky that makes you remember old songs and think about the people you haven't called in too long. A long stretch of highway carved between hills rolled ahead like a memory you couldn't quite put into words. Chuck Norris drove in steady silence, both hands resting lightly on the wheel of his dark green 1970 Plymouth Roadrunner. The engine hummed beneath him, low and smooth like a dog guarding the porch but not barking yet. In the passenger seat sat Maggie Norris, his older sister, back straight, hands folded over a small brown envelope she hadn't let go of since they left. She hadn't spoken much since they pulled onto Highway 190 that morning, but her silence wasn't heavy, just full. Chuck glanced her way once or twice. She didn't notice. Her eyes were out the window, following the horizon like she was trying to catch up with something that had left a long time ago. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself more than a few times. They hadn't taken a trip together in over 20 years, not since their mother's funeral, not since the family fractured like glass under heat. But here they were again, sharing space, sharing road, riding toward a veterans' memorial event neither of them was entirely prepared to face. Chuck had agreed to drive her because Maggie had asked without asking. She simply said she'd like to go, that she couldn't drive that far anymore, that her back wasn't what it used to be. He'd said sure, without hesitation, though deep down he knew it wasn't about the drive. It was about what this trip represented. A return. A reckoning. And maybe for both of them, a quiet kind of healing. They passed a faded sign for Lampasas. Still another 2 hours to San Angelo if the road stayed kind. Maggie shifted, finally, and opened the envelope on her lap. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. Yellowed, a little torn at the fold, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. Chuck caught a glimpse of her name signed at the bottom, along with a date. March 12, 1975. He said nothing, kept his eyes on the road. But his curiosity leaned in. Maggie smoothed the paper gently, as if it might crack. Her voice came softly, like she was talking to herself more than to him. I wrote this the week after Daniel shipped out. Vietnam. He never got it. I never mailed it. Chuck didn't respond, not yet. He knew the value of letting silence do its work. Let the story come when it's ready. Maggie looked down at the page again. It was never meant to be some grand confession, just a thank you, and maybe a goodbye. I think I was scared that if I mailed it, it would make everything too real. And back then, you didn't ask men to stay. You just watched them leave and prayed they would come back. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. Chuck finally spoke, quiet and measured. And now? She didn't look at him, just stared ahead. Now I want to know if he made it. I want to know if he ever wondered why I disappeared, or if he forgot me completely. Chuck gave a small nod, not out of judgment, just understanding. He thought of the things he hadn't said to people. Friends lost in deployment, students he'd mentored who vanished into civilian life. Not everyone gets to finish the sentence. He glanced at her again, this time with something close to pride. She'd always been the brave one, the one who raised him when their father went cold after the war. She was 13 years older, more mother than sister, especially after their mum passed. But somewhere along the way, life had put space between them. Distance. Mistrust. time. Now, sitting beside him in the fading October light, she looked smaller than he remembered. Not weak, just softer, quieter. A woman carrying a lot more than that envelope in her lap. Chuck reached forward and adjusted the radio dial. Static at first. Then a slow, raspy country voice broke through. One of those songs about trains, lost love, and God. Maggie smiled, the first real smile of the trip. I used to play this in the kitchen, remember? You were always pretending to hate it. Chuck chuckled. Still do. She laughed, and for a second the years between them faded. They drove like that for a while, letting the music fill in the gaps. The road unfolded beneath them, lined with barbed wire fences and stubborn mesquite trees. A lone hawk drifted overhead, the kind of Texas drive that feels like it's pulling you inward, not just westward. As they neared the outskirts of Eden, the fuel light flickered. Chuck tapped the gauge. We'll need to stop soon. The next town's about 15 miles, maybe less. Maggie leaned forward. I don't remember this part of the state. Looks like the kind of place where stories don't leave. He glanced her way. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? She gave a shrug, a half smile. Depends on the story. The road narrowed as they turned off the main highway. Chuck wasn't fond of taking back routes, but the GPS had flagged construction delays up ahead. He preferred momentum. Maggie, as always, agreed. Within 10 minutes they passed a crooked sign that read Willow Glen. No population count, no welcome message, just peeling paint and bent nails. It didn't look like much. A few weathered buildings, one gas station, a diner that may or may not still serve food, and a long-abandoned post office. But it was enough. Chuck pulled into the gas station, the kind with pumps older than most high schoolers and a little office with cracked glass windows. He stepped out and scanned the area. No one in sight, just the slow creak of a wind-blown flag and the tick-tick of his cooling engine. Maggie opened her door carefully, still holding the envelope. She said she wanted to stretch her legs, maybe walk over to the antique shop across the lot. Chuck gave a nod. Yell if you need me. Always do. She smiled, then disappeared through the dusty glass doors of the shop, a little bell chiming behind her. Chuck watched her go. Something in his gut tightened. He chalked it up to nerves. This wasn't just another errand. This trip meant something, for her, for him. He knew enough to listen to that feeling, but not enough to act on it yet. He turned back to the pump and started filling the tank, his eyes still drifting to the window where she had vanished. Inside the shop, Maggie was struck by the smell of old paper, leather, and varnish. The kind of place where time felt sticky. She moved slowly past rows of dusty shelves, jars of buttons, faded war medals, and cracked photo frames. Somewhere in the back, a fan clicked in a lazy rhythm. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but part of her hoped something would find her. Near a shelf marked military memorabilia, she paused. There it was. A black and white photo, worn at the edges. 4 young soldiers in uniform. One of them, God help her, it looked like Daniel, just barely. Her eyes were the same, her jaw was softer, and her smile was more naive than she remembered. But it was him. Below the frame, a metal nameplate read, Delta Squad, Da Nang, 1972. Maggie felt the letter in her pocket grow heavier. She swallowed, her throat dry. She turned to the man behind the counter, a wiry old gentleman with a crooked nose and a cane leaning near his stool. You know who that is? She asked. He peered over his glasses, slow and deliberate. That's Daniel Mason. Used to run the Iron House before his legs gave out. Lives down the road now. Doesn't see many folks. Don't talk much either. She nodded. Her voice came quieter. He served with my husband, a long time ago. The old man gave her a long look. Not unkind. Funny how time has a way of putting things back in front of us. Maggie gave a half smile. That's what I'm afraid of. Meanwhile, Chuck finished pumping gas and walked inside. He found her standing still, staring at the photo. "You find something?" Maggie nodded. "I think we just found him." Chuck followed her eyes to the photo. Something in his chest tightened. Not fear, not dread, just gravity. He looked at Maggie. "You ready?" She didn't answer right away. I just slid the photo closer, touched the nameplate gently, and then turned back toward the door. "As I'll ever be." They stepped back into the sun together, the light lower now, stretching shadows long across the concrete. The road ahead would take them deeper into memory, into reckoning, but for now, it was enough just to keep moving forward. They got back in the car. Chuck started the engine. The hum returned, steady as ever. No one spoke for a while. They just drove, both thinking about the same man, the same letter, and the weight of words never sent. But some words once spoken aloud, even after 50 years, have a way of changing everything, even if you don't know how the story ends. The road began to change before the town even came into view. The pavement cracked more often, the shoulder thinned, and fences along the side looked more like memory than boundary. Chuck noticed it first. Maggie didn't say much, but her hand went instinctively to the envelope in her lap. That one gesture told him enough. Willow Glen wasn't a name he remembered. It wasn't the kind of place that showed up on maps or in stories. It sat on the edge of nowhere, halfway between then and now. The kind of town people drove through without ever stopping, or stopped in and never told anyone. They rolled past a rusted water tower, its faded paint peeling under years of sun. Below it, the town opened up like an old drawer. Quiet, dusty, and full of things people forgot they had. There was a barber pole still spinning with effort, though the shop behind it looked closed. A diner with a bent sign that read "Eats" leaned slightly to one side. And then there was the gas station. It sat on the corner like it had been waiting for them. One lonely pump, a canopy that creaked with the breeze, and an office that had seen too many summers. Chuck eased the car beside the pump, cutting the engine with one slow turn of his wrist. Maggie stepped out carefully, stretching her legs, shielding her eyes from the light. She said she needed a walk. Just a few minutes. Her voice was casual, but her eyes were scanning. Not afraid, not yet, but alert in that quiet way only people who've lived enough years understand. Chuck gave a nod. He didn't need to remind her to stay close. She was already thinking 2 steps ahead. While he worked the pump, Maggie walked along the sidewalk. Her steps were steady, purposeful, but not hurried. She passed a hardware store that looked like it hadn't restocked in years, a shoe repair shop with its front window clouded with age. Then she saw it. A small place tucked between 2 boarded buildings. The sign read "Second Chance Antiques." The door opened with a chime that sounded like a whisper. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of cedar and old cloth. Light filtered in through dusty windows, painting the room in soft gold. Maggie stood still for a moment, then stepped deeper inside. She moved slowly past shelves of forgotten things, porcelain figurines, black and white wedding portraits, mason jars full of buttons, and a rack of old military coats. Each item felt like it carried a story, a name, a silence. In the back, she stopped. There it was, a glass display case with service medals, folded flags and photographs. One picture caught her breath. A young man in uniform, laughing, head tilted slightly, the jawline, the eyes. It was Daniel. He couldn't have been more than 20. She reached out, barely touching the frame. The letter in her bag seemed to press harder against her side. She wasn't ready. Not here. Not like this. So she stepped back. That's when she noticed the 2 men standing outside. They weren't browsing. They weren't talking. They were watching. One leaned against a bike, arms crossed. The other stood a little straighter, mirrored glasses hiding his eyes, but his focus was unmistakable. Maggie squared her shoulders and moved toward the exit. The taller one gave a slow nod as she passed. His voice was easy, but edged with something colder. "Afternoon, ma'am. You just passing through?" Maggie's voice stayed calm. "Just stretching my legs." The other one chuckled, thin, wiry, with a scar that ran the length of his cheek. He said this part of town wasn't always as friendly as it looked. She didn't flinch. Years of practice helped her keep her breath even. She turned and walked away. Every step she took was measured, like the ground might shift if she moved too fast. Chuck was finishing up at the pump when he saw her approach. He noticed the way her jaw was set, the way her shoulders leaned forward just a little. He looked past her and saw the two men. They were still standing there, but now their eyes were on him. He didn't stare, just took a breath, nodded to Maggie and said they should get moving. She didn't argue. They got back in the car and pulled out slowly. Chuck didn't speak, but he checked the rear view twice more than usual. The bikers didn't follow, but he had a feeling they would. A few miles out, the silence settled. Maggie finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but not weak. They weren't just being curious. They knew something, or someone. Chuck kept his eyes forward. "Yeah. And they didn't expect to see us." She looked down at the letter again. It was as if the weight of the town had transferred into the envelope itself. Her fingers rested on it like it could keep her grounded. "Maybe this whole thing was never about the letter," she said. "Maybe it was about what the letter was trying not to say." Chuck thought about that. People sometimes write to remember, but more often they write to forget. He didn't answer right away. Some truths take longer to surface. He turned the wheel gently as the road curved along a ridge. Below them, the hills stretched out in quiet layers. But the tension wasn't behind them, not anymore. It was moving with them now. Maggie didn't ask if they were being followed. She didn't need to. She knew. And Chuck, in his own way, was already planning for what might come next. What neither of them knew was how close the past had actually crept. The road narrowed as Chuck and Maggie rolled deeper into Willow Glen. The air had changed just slightly. Quieter, more still, like the town had been holding its breath for years. Willow Glen looked like a place where time passed by without stopping. A diner with a sagging awning, a barber shop with sun-faded posters, and a fire station that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in a decade. Everything felt paused, like someone hit stop on a movie and forgot to press play again. Maggie looked out the window, eyes scanning the storefronts. She didn't speak, but her fingers tapped lightly on the envelope in her lap. Chuck noticed, but said nothing. Sometimes people need silence to hear what matters. They passed a row of bikes lined up outside a corner bar, shiny, loud, and a little too polished for the kind of town they were in. Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't like anything that didn't match its surroundings. He eased the car into a spot outside the only gas station still open. It had a single pump, a rusted canopy, and a bell above the door that looked like it hadn't rung in a while. Chuck stepped out and stretched his back. Maggie followed, slower, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun. She said she needed a walk, just a few minutes. Her voice was casual, but her eyes were scanning. Not afraid, not yet, but alert in that quiet way only people who've lived enough years understand. Chuck gave a nod. He didn't need to remind her to stay close. She was already thinking 2 steps ahead. While he worked the pump, Maggie walked along the sidewalk. Her steps were steady, purposeful, but not hurried. She passed a hardware store that looked like it hadn't restocked in years, a shoe repair shop with its front window clouded with age. Then she saw it, a small place tucked between 2 boarded buildings. The sign read, "Second Chance Antiques." The door opened with a chime that sounded like a whisper. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of cedar and old cloth. Light filtered in through dusty windows, painting the room in soft gold. Maggie stood still for a moment, then stepped deeper inside. She moved slowly past shelves of forgotten things. Porcelain figurines, black and white wedding portraits, mason jars full of buttons, and a rack of old military coats. Each item felt like it carried a story, a name, a silence. In the back, she stopped. There it was, a glass display case with service medals, folded flags and photographs. One picture caught her breath. A young man in uniform, laughing, head tilted slightly, the jawline, the eyes. It was Daniel. He couldn't have been more than 20. She reached out, barely touching the frame. The letter in her bag seemed to press harder against her side. She wasn't ready. Not here. Not like this. So she stepped back. That's when she noticed the two men standing outside. They weren't browsing, they weren't talking, they were watching. One leaned against a bike, arms crossed. The other stood a little straighter, mirrored glasses hiding his eyes, but his focus was unmistakable. Maggie squared her shoulders and moved toward the exit. The taller one gave a slow nod as she passed. His voice was easy but edged with something colder. "Afternoon, ma'am? You just passing through?" Maggie's voice stayed calm. "Just stretching my legs." The other one chuckled. Thin, wiry, with a scar that ran the length of his cheek. He said this part of town wasn't always as friendly as it looked. She didn't flinch. Years of practice helped her keep her breath even. She turned and walked away. Every step she took was measured, like the ground might shift if she moved too fast. Chuck was finishing up at the pump when he saw her approach. He noticed the way her jaw was set, the way her shoulders leaned forward just a little. He looked past her and saw the two men. They were still standing there, but now their eyes were on him. He didn't stare, just took a breath, nodded to Maggie, and said they should get moving. She didn't argue. They got back in the car and pulled out slowly. Chuck didn't speak, but he checked the rear view twice, more than usual. The bikers didn't follow, but he had a feeling they would. A few miles out, the silence settled. Maggie finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but not weak. They weren't just being curious. They knew something, or someone. Chuck kept his eyes forward. "Yeah, and they didn't expect to see us." She looked down at the letter again. It was as if the weight of the town had transferred into the envelope itself. Her fingers rested on it like it could keep her grounded. "Maybe this whole thing was never about the letter," she said. "Maybe it was about what the letter was trying not to say." Chuck thought about that. People sometimes write to remember, but more often they write to forget. He didn't answer right away. Some truths take longer to surface. He turned the wheel gently as the road curved along a ridge. Below them, the hills stretched out in quiet layers, but the tension wasn't behind them, not anymore. It was moving with them now. Maggie didn't ask if they were being followed. She didn't need to. She knew, and Chuck, in his own way, was already planning for what might come next. What neither of them knew was how close the past had actually crept. The road leading out of Willow Glen looked open, but Chuck knew better. Some things follow you without headlights. The afternoon light had softened to amber, washing the hills in gold, but neither of them seemed to notice. Maggie sat quietly, holding that envelope as if it were part of her. Chuck kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the console, his eyes scanning the mirror more than the road. They hadn't seen the bikers again, but that meant nothing. Real danger didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waited. Chuck had learned that the hard way, more than once. They reached a small overlook a few miles out. Chuck slowed and pulled off. The view opened wide across the valley. Below, the shadow of the hills stretched long across open pasture. It was the kind of place that made people feel small in the best way. He stepped out and stretched his legs. Maggie followed, slower. She walked to the guardrail and leaned on it. Her eyes weren't on the view. They were on the road behind them. She said they didn't follow, Chuck answered without looking, yet. Then she asked what he saw in their eyes. He said nothing at first, then told her the truth. Control and fear disguised as confidence. Maggie nodded. She'd seen it too. The kind of presence that tries too hard. People like that never lead. They intimidate. And they collapse the moment someone stares back. Chuck stepped beside her. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the dry grass. Maggie turned to him and said she recognized the symbol on one of their vests. The bird. But it was wrong. The feathers were clipped. He looked at her. She explained that Daniel used to wear something like it, back when they were young, but the original had full wings. The new version looked broken, like someone had taken an oath and twisted it. Chuck didn't say anything. He just filed it away. Some details matter more later. They got back in the car and drove on. A few minutes down the road, a small station came into view. Old, half boarded up, but open. Chuck decided to stop. Needed water, needed a chance to breathe without the sense of being watched. Maggie stayed in the car. Inside, the place smelled like motor oil and stale coffee. Behind the counter was an older man in a tan vest. He wore a patch on the left breast. Faded, but the same bird. Chuck asked about the patch. The man didn't answer right away. Then he said it used to mean something, years ago. It was a club for veterans. Started with a purpose, ended with pride. But now? Now it was mostly noise. He said the kids wore the symbol, but forgot the meaning. Chuck thanked him, bought 2 bottles of water. When he stepped back outside, Maggie was looking through a local flyer she'd found in the car. There was a name on the back, Iron House. She asked if it sounded familiar. He nodded slowly. He'd heard it before, a long time ago. It wasn't just a club, it was a refuge, a place built by returning soldiers, a place meant to last. They followed the directions from the flyer. It took them down a side road flanked by trees that looked tired but tall. The sun had started its slow drop. Shadows lengthened. Iron House appeared at the end of a gravel lane, a low, wide building made of stone and steel. Not pretty, but proud. There was a flagpole out front and a small plaque by the steps, dedicated to those who served and those who couldn't come back. Chuck parked and turned off the engine. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Maggie opened her door and stepped out. They walked slowly toward the entrance. Maggie held the letter now, not tucked away, but open in her hand like it was ready. Or she was. Inside, the place was quiet. The walls held old photographs, framed patches and names engraved in wood. Men sat at tables drinking coffee, reading newspapers, not talking much. They looked up when Chuck and Maggie entered. One of them stood, big, grey, but steady. His eyes sharpened when he saw them. He asked if they were looking for someone. Maggie said they were hoping to speak to Daniel Mason. The man studied her, then nodded. He pointed down a hallway. Last room on the right. But he warned them Daniel wasn't who he used to be. Not in body, maybe not even in mind. Maggie thanked him. Her voice was steady. Chuck followed her down the hall. The floor creaked beneath their steps. The walls carried echoes. At the last door she paused, took a breath, then knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. So she opened the door slowly. The room was dim. A single lamp, a bed, a chair, and a man sitting by the window looking out. Daniel didn't turn around, but he spoke. Said he didn't get visitors anymore. Maggie said, maybe that should change. He turned. Slowly, his face aged, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said her name. That was the moment the past stood still. She walked in quietly. Chuck stayed by the door, watching, listening. Daniel asked what took her so long. She said, life. and fear, and maybe foolish pride. He nodded, said he understood, said those were the same things that kept him from ever going back. She handed him the letter, said it was meant for him, a long time ago. He took it with hands that trembled just slightly, held it, didn't open it, just looked at it. Then he looked at Chuck. He said he knew who he was. He had known it since the moment he heard the name. Chuck said, "Names don't matter, actions do." Daniel smiled, tired but real. Then he told them what had happened. The club they started for veterans had changed. Younger men came in, brought new rules, new anger. They kept the patches, but not the principles. They turned the symbol into something it was never meant to be. Daniel tried to stop it, but he got pushed out. Quietly, no threats, just absence. No one listened, they just stopped answering. Maggie sat beside him now, her voice is softer. She said she saw one of those men today, said he looked hollow, all posture, no purpose. Daniel nodded, said that was the worst part, not the rejection, but the loss of meaning. He said they used to ride to heal, now they ride to scare. Chuck asked where they were based now. Daniel looked out the window. Said they claimed Willow Glen, but they operated beyond it. Said they were calling it tradition, but all he saw was control. Chuck thanked him, said they didn't mean to stir anything, but silence wasn't helping either. Daniel looked at Maggie, then back to the letter. He said he'd read it later, when the silence returned. They stood. Chuck shook his hand, firm, respectful. Daniel held on an extra second, said, "Thank you. Not just for today, but to keep something true, even if it is quiet." They left the room in silence. The hallway seemed longer now. The weight is heavier. Outside the sky was deepening. Purple brushed the edges. Maggie didn't speak. Chuck didn't ask. But something had shifted. They both felt it. And somewhere behind them, in that room of dim light and memory, a man sat still, holding a letter, and remembering a different version of himself, a version worth saving. They got back in the car. Chuck started the engine. The sound broke the hush. As they pulled away from Iron House, the road ahead looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Sometimes the past doesn't ask you to fix it, it just asks you to face it. And they had. The next morning brought a quiet kind of tension, not the heavy kind that clings to your chest, but the subtle one that lingers around the edges of decision. Chuck and Maggie ate breakfast in near silence. The small diner off the highway served watery coffee and overcooked eggs, but neither of them seemed to mind. Maggie stared out the window while Chuck paid the bill. She wasn't looking at anything in particular, just watching the way the light moved over the windshield. Sometimes that's what clarity feels like. Not a sudden answer, just the absence of confusion. Back in the car, Chuck didn't ask if she wanted to continue. He already knew. What they started yesterday hadn't ended with the letter being handed over. Something was still unfinished. Maggie had spent the night replaying the conversation with Daniel in her mind. The room, the look on his face, the way his fingers trembled when he held the envelope. But mostly it was what he hadn't said that stayed with her. They drove without music, just the sound of the road. When they reached Willow Glen again, it didn't surprise either of them that the place looked unchanged. Time had a way of skipping this town. Chuck parked at the edge of the square, just far enough to keep their arrival quiet. Maggie spotted the antique shop and walked toward it without hesitation. Chuck followed but kept his distance. Inside, the shop owner recognized her. He offered a polite nod. No questions. Maggie moved toward the back, where the photo of Daniel and his squad had been. She stood there for a while, then noticed something new. A metal storage box. Unlocked. Old, dented and sitting on a low shelf. She opened it slowly. Inside were personal items, pins, badges, a small leather notebook with initials, DWM. She held it in her hands like it might fall apart. Chuck stepped beside her. She looked up and showed him the cover. He nodded. They took the notebook to the counter. Maggie asked the owner where it came from. He said someone dropped it off a few weeks ago. No name. Just said it belonged here more than anywhere else. Chuck asked if it was one of the younger bikers. The man hesitated, then said it might have been. One with a scar on his cheek. Maggie opened the notebook. Inside were brief entries, scribbled thoughts. One page read like an address book, scattered names. One stood out. Franklin Reeves, written in all caps, next to it, a word in parentheses, founder. Chuck pointed to it. He remembered the name, not from Daniel, but from a report years ago. A man who helped start the original Veteran Riders chapter. A respected leader who vanished from the public eye. Maggie asked if he was still alive. Chuck said, maybe. If he were, he'd be older than all of them, but men like that don't disappear by accident. They decided to find out. A quick call to a contact in San Antonio confirmed it. Franklin Reeves was living off-grid, but not invisible. He had a small place in the hills west of Kerrville. Off a dirt road, no cell reception, just a landline and a locked gate. They left Willow Glen without a word. This time the town didn't watch them go, or maybe it did, but kept its thoughts to itself. The drive to Kerrville took hours, long winding stretches through land that still looked like Texas before highways. Chuck didn't mind. He preferred roads that asked you to think. When they reached the gate, it was already open. That part surprised them. Maggie looked at Chuck. He looked at the sky, then drove in. The house was modest, wood and stone, smoke curling from a chimney. A figure sat on the porch. He had a hat and a cane across his lap. When they parked, he didn't move, just waited. Chuck and Maggie got out slowly, walked together, neither one leading. As they approached, the man raised his head. His face was a road map of time. Deep lines, quiet eyes, a life written in long chapters. He looked at Maggie first, then at Chuck, then said, "You're here about the patch?" Chuck nodded. Maggie said, "She was here about Daniel." Franklin Reeves listened without speaking. When they finished, he took a breath. Said he'd been waiting for someone to show up. Just didn't know who. He invited them inside. The living room was lined with books, framed photos, and quiet. A kettle whistled from the kitchen. He poured tea without asking if they wanted it, then sat. He told them the real story. The patch wasn't a brand. It was a bond, born out of nights when men had nothing but each other, when the world didn't know what to do with soldiers who came home changed. The eagle was always meant to soar, not to threaten, but somewhere along the line, anger took the wheel, and younger men turned the bond into a badge of power. He said he tried to stop it. Daniel did too, but they were outnumbered, outshouted. The mission got lost. Chuck asked about the men in Willow Glen. Franklin's face hardened. He said those boys weren't carrying the torch, they were burning the house. Maggie showed him the notebook, asked about the entries. He recognized the handwriting, said Daniel wrote in bursts, always between silence and memory. Then Franklin said something unexpected. He'd seen the scarred biker before, a boy named Reef. Not born into the club, pulled in by others, smart, but mean when afraid. He said Reef once tried to ask about the past, about the meaning, but got laughed at, mocked by his own crew, so he turned cruel instead of curious. That was the moment Chuck leaned forward. He said maybe the problem wasn't just bad leadership, maybe it was a vacuum, an absence of men who knew how to lead by being. Franklin didn't answer, but he looked tired in a new way. Maggie asked one final question: if the original meaning of the club could be restored. Franklin said only if someone reminded them, not with speeches but with presence. They left his house just before sundown. The sky had shifted again. This time it felt like movement. Not closure, but a start. As they drove back, neither spoke much, but the silence was no longer distant. It was intentional. Chuck was already thinking about what needed to happen next. And Maggie, she finally felt the letter had done its job, not by being read, but by leading them to what mattered most. The truth doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it arrives as a choice, one you didn't expect, but can't ignore it. The drive back into Willow Glen was slower this time, not because of the road, but because of what they were about to do. Chuck kept both hands on the wheel. His eyes were calm, focused. Maggie sat beside him, hands folded in her lap. The letter was gone now, left with Daniel, but its purpose had only just begun to unfold. They had a direction now, a reason, and a message to deliver. Though it wouldn't come in the form of words, it would come in person, in clarity, in refusing to be small in front of people who built their identity on intimidation. As they entered the edge of town, the light had started to shift. Late afternoon, long shadows. The same row of bikes sat outside the same corner bar. But this time, Chuck didn't avoid them. He pulled into the lot, slowly, deliberately. Maggie didn't ask why. She already knew. Some conversations had to happen where everyone could see. Chuck turned off the engine, stepped out, took his time. Maggie followed. The wind picked up slightly, lifting dust from the gravel. Two of the bikers from before were already watching. Scarface stood up from the bench out front. His smile was different this time, less playful, more prepared. He asked if they were lost again. Maggie said they knew exactly where they were. The biker chuckled. Said brave words come easier in daylight. Chuck looked at him. Not hard, just steady. Then said they needed to talk somewhere more private. Scarface hesitated, then shrugged. Said fine. Inside. The bar smelled like sour beer and old stories. Tables were scattered. A few younger men sat near the back, eyes fixed on Chuck and Maggie as they entered. One of them tapped something on his phone. Chuck noticed. Scarface led them to a booth near the back. Maggie didn't sit. Chuck did. Slowly, he placed both hands on the table. Open. Relax. He said he knew what the patch meant, what it used to mean. Said he'd met the man who founded it, and the one they pushed out. He told them about Franklin, about Daniel, about the letter, and the story it carried. The bikers listened, but not all of them believed. One of them scoffed. Said those old men had their time. Now it was theirs. Chuck nodded, said he understood the feeling, but reminded them that leading without grounding isn't leadership, it's noise. And noise fades fast. He said, symbols without meaning become threats, and threats don't last. Not when someone finally stops being afraid of them. The room had gone still now. Scarface looked around, then leaned forward. He said Chuck talked a good game, but asked what made him think anyone cared. Maggie stepped closer. She said she cared because the man they tried to break that day was her brother, and the woman they mocked was someone who had spent her life holding people together when war tore them apart. She said, strength isn't loud, it's steady, quiet, unshakable. That's what Chuck brought into that station. That's what they couldn't stand. Scarface looked away, but one of the younger men at the bar stood up, said nothing, just nodded once, quiet, then left. Chuck stood. Maggie placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. He looked around one last time, then said he wasn't here to fight. He was here to return something, a name, a memory, a meaning. As they walked out, another biker followed them to the parking lot. He asked Chuck why he even bothered. Why not just let the whole thing burn? Chuck turned to him. Said because some things are worth rebuilding, even if only one person remembers why they mattered. The biker didn't reply, just stood there, watching, maybe wondering. Later that evening, Chuck and Maggie returned to Iron House. The lights were on, warm through the windows. Daniel was there, so was Franklin, and now a few more had joined. Men they hadn't seen before, older, some younger, all quiet, all present. Chuck stepped in and stood by the wall, not as a leader, just as a witness. Maggie sat near Daniel. They didn't speak, just shared space. Franklin rose slowly, held up the original patch, the eagle, whole, full wings. He said he didn't need to speak long, because words only go so far. He said, presence matters more. So does the choice to stand still when fear tells you to run. He said someone had reminded them of that, not with fists, not with speeches, but with presence, and that man was in the room. Chuck didn't shift, didn't move, just nodded. Then Daniel spoke, said he'd read the letter, twice, said it wasn't just for him, it was for all of them, a reminder that silence can hold more truth than shouting ever could. They ended the evening with no ceremony, just quiet, just shared stillness, the kind that doesn't need applause. Later, in the car, Maggie leaned back in her seat. Her voice was soft. She said that was the most peace she'd felt in years. Chuck didn't answer right away, just looked at the road. Then said, peace doesn't always come from winning, sometimes it comes from showing up. She smiled, closed her eyes. The road back to the motel stretched ahead, smooth under the night sky. Behind them, in Willow Glen, something had shifted. The noise was still there, but it no longer filled the silence. The silence now had weight, meaning, and that was enough for one day. The morning after the gathering at Iron House arrived soft and still, the kind of morning where light filters slowly through the clouds and the world feels like it's taking a breath. Chuck stepped outside the motel room first. The air had cooled overnight. A thin mist hovered just above the pavement, and the only sound was the distant rustle of wind brushing the trees. Maggie joined him a few minutes later, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. No cream, no sugar, just black, strong, and honest. They stood in silence, looking out toward the horizon. They didn't need to speak. The weight of what had happened the night before still hung between them. But it wasn't heavy. It was steady, resolute. The ride back through the hill country was quiet too. No traffic, no distractions, just winding roads and memories still settling into place. They weren't rushing anymore. Sometimes, once you've said what needed to be said, there's no hurry, just direction. Chuck took the longer route. He said it gave him time to think. Maggie didn't argue. The detour led them past ranches, broken fences, and old churches with signs that hadn't been changed in weeks. At a bend in the road, they passed a line of bikes parked under a tree. Young riders, not the same group, but something about the way they sat told a familiar story. They nodded to Chuck as he passed. A nod back was enough. Respect doesn't always come loud. By the time they reached the Austin city limits, the sun was leaning toward afternoon. Maggie asked if he had time for one more stop. Chuck smiled. He always did. They pulled into the same Veterans Memorial where the gala was supposed to be. It had ended the night before without them. But that didn't matter. The heart of what mattered had already happened, just not under chandeliers. Maggie walked through the stone archway. Names carved deep into polished granite lined both sides. Names of men who came home, and the names of those who didn't. Chuck followed behind, letting her lead this time. She stopped at the wall marked 1971. Her hand touched the name Daniel Mason. Below it, a brass plate had been added, not fallen, but honored. It had been done quietly, likely Franklin's doing. She stood there for a while. Then she said what had been circling in her chest for days, and that she had carried the letter for too long, that she thought she was writing it for him. But she realized it was for her. Closure doesn't always come when something ends. Sometimes it arrives when something finally begins again. Chuck listened, didn't interrupt. When she turned, he nodded. That was the only answer she needed. Later, over lunch, they spoke about the future. Maggie said she wanted to stay involved, reconnect with old networks, help rebuild what had been lost in silence. Chuck told her that presence alone can wake people up. Sometimes all it takes is for someone willing to stand in the doorway and not move. She laughed, said that sounded like him. He smiled, said it sounded like her. In the days that followed, Chuck visited Iron House again, this time alone. He brought with him something he hadn't shown anyone in years, his own service patch, folded, pressed and kept in the drawer beside his bed. He placed it on the wall next to Daniel's photo. No speech, no audience, just a moment. Word spread. Slowly, quietly, men who had drifted from the original purpose began to ask questions. Some showed up at Iron House, some sent letters, some just sat outside and watched. But presence has a way of stirring something deeper, especially when it comes without demands. Scarface didn't return. Not right away, but Reef did. The younger one with the scar. He came in one morning. No patch, no bike, just a question. He asked if there was still room for someone who wanted to learn, not lead. Franklin welcomed him. So did Daniel. So did Chuck, not with open arms, but with steady ones, because leadership doesn't always look like arrival. Sometimes it looks like showing up, unsure, and staying anyway. By the third week, the patch began to appear again, but different, not the clipped wings, the whole eagle, restored, quiet, earned. Chuck stayed out of the spotlight. That wasn't his role, but he was always near, helping, guiding, saying less and meaning more. Maggie hosted the next small gathering, a simple meal, a circle of chairs, no titles, no rank, just people sharing what they'd seen and what they hoped to repair. At the end of the month, a new plaque was installed at Iron House. It read, "Legacy is not in what you carry, it's in what you choose to lay down." Maggie stood beside it. Chuck stood behind her. Around them, men who once led with volume were learning to lead with presence. And that day, in the glow of a quiet sunset, the sound of engines in the distance didn't bring tension, it brought hope. Because now, the ones who rode understood the road meant something again. Chuck didn't say much on the drive home, but Maggie did. She said, for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a memory. She felt like a part of what's next. Chuck smiled. That was always the point. And sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is stand still when the world asks them to move, or speak when everyone else is quiet, or remain quiet when the room demands noise. This story didn't end with applause, it ended with understanding, and it started again with commitment. Because the real measure of influence isn't in how many followers there are, it's in how deeply you walk your truth. And in that town, with those people, Chuck Norris left no doubt. Some men fight with their fists, others fight with silence. But the ones who last, the ones who shape others, fight with honor. And honor never fades.